Segue, to continue at once with the next musical selection or composition.
Segue, to make a transition directly from one section or theme to another.
Segue, to move smoothly and unhesitatingly from one state, situation, condition, or element to another.
Segue, to perform in the manner of the preceding section.
Segue, to make a transition from one thing to another smoothly and without interruption.
This is Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the College of Arts and Sciences at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville.
Hello everybody. Professor Darryl Coan was born in Denver, Colorado. He obtained his bachelor's in music education from Illinois State University and his master's and doctorate also in music education from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Today, he is a professor and chair in the Department of Music at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. Welcome to Segue, Professor Coan.
Thank you, Al.
Do you want me to call you doctor or professor? Because in music, few people like to be called doctor.
I like professor, actually.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, although most musicians know very early on in their life that they want to be musicians, and actually they get their training as a child and everything else, what made you take the path of music education? How come you came to the conclusion that your real destiny in life wasn't to be a performer per se, but rather someone who was going to teach about music?
Yeah, that's a good question. And of course, I was kind of performing from the time I was a little kid. But I think for almost all teachers who love the profession, who went into it because they liked the idea of that, it's because you generally have a mentor or a teacher that you admired when you were young, and it was a sort of catalyst then for thought that, gee, I think I could do this, and I think I could do it pretty well, and I think that's true of me.
So it sounds like a teacher made a difference in your life. Do you still think along those lines today as a teacher, as someone who can make a difference in the lives of many people?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And you think that's the most satisfying part of your job?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, welcome to a large club of people we are being interviewing for Segue.
Yeah.
Because they're all in the same business. So let me ask you a question, more general question, which is, how do you see the current status of music education in this country?
Well, that's a great question because since the educational aspect of it is my field and I'm operating on all the possible levels of that right now, from the academic and professional side down to being out in public schools and having my own children taking music in public schools. There are some things which are very, very heartening. We have a current generation of music teachers who take it very, very seriously. They realize that in many instances the job is not a sure thing. I always say there is always a job for a good music teacher, not just any music teacher, but a good one. And I think students understand that. Our students understand it, and I think around the country I know a lot of young professional music educators, not just around here, but from other states. And I see this. I see them. They're very serious. They're very earnest. They work hard to improve their teaching. They work hard to make sure their students have a good musical experience. And not that hasn't always been true to some extent, but I just think there's something about that old saying, the hungry dog runs faster. Mm-hmm. I think that's true. I think they're both committed and passionate about it, but also they understand what's at stake, that in a educational atmosphere where the federal government takes a much larger role and control over what happens in the local school, which has not historically been the case. And strings come with that. Money comes with that, sort of, and strings come with that, and the strings are always applied even when the money isn't. And so there are a lot of challenges for all arts professionals in any field, any area of teaching, but the arts are especially vulnerable, and unless a music educator makes it patently obvious that what they do is important to a community, then they partly have themselves to blame if that program is cut.
I was asking that question because, we have heard many stories in the last 10, 15 years about how funding for the arts in general in public schools have been cut. So I was wondering if it is just a matter of money, or has that had some kind of impact on the quality of the music education that the kids are receiving these days?
It has an impact on the quality when the cuts are short-sighted. For instance, if you have a K through 12 school system and you think it won't be damaging to cut, say, middle school band, well, you have just unintentionally cut your high school band. Because where do you think that comes from? And that's what I mean by short-sighted, and we've had some examples of that happening, and luckily in a prominent case, the program was restored, the younger band program. Music is about experience, and experience is not something that I can teach you. It's something that you have to gain over time. And in order to have a thriving program in your high school that draws people to your community, you have to have a thriving program in your elementary school, which, by the way, will also draw people to your community. And we know from plenty of correlational research that the musical benefits or the academic benefits that children in music display. Whether it's causal, we think so. We still don't know for sure, but the correlations are so strong that it's hard to imagine that it isn't.
Now, besides what you can learn in school in terms of performing and the experience that you were talking about, there is another dimension to all this, which is music literacy, is how well-versed you are to understand music when you hear it. And, for example, what's the difference between classical music and romantic music and Baroque and all that kind of basic things. How do you think is the state of music literacy in the United States at this point?
I think that depends on your perspective of what musical literacy is. If by that you mean classical music and very sophisticated academic aspects of music, score reading, things like that, I would say in general that it's not that great, nor has it ever been. I mean, I've read articles from well over 100 years ago from national music conferences where they were bemoaning the lack of classical musical knowledge on the part of people in schools and in communities and such. And I don't see it as that. I'm not really an elitist at all musically. I like a lot of kinds of music, and I see literacy as being more something that you gain experience in music. And I think right now we have more musical literacy than we've ever had, by that definition. Because I don't know, all you really need to do is step out of your building and see how many sets of headphones there are. Now, is all music that they're listening to, different or equally beneficial? What I know is that when I talk to students, they actually have a fairly, nowadays, much more so than in 20 years ago, they have a very eclectic sense of music. They like to listen to a lot of different things. There are a lot of world influences in their music. And not only that, within genres that we think are just, you and I might say is just like one genre, within those, they have many, many subgenres, and I find that the students know those very well. And they're very sophisticated in their sense of what is good and what isn't good. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that's the power of experience. If you've spent thousands of hours listening to music, you are gaining musical experience, and therefore my idea of musical literacy. Now, how that should be reflected in education, that's a big issue.
And I was wondering then, what would be the impact, or what has been the impact, rather, of popular culture in music literacy? Let me give you an example. The movie Amadeus. I remember when it came out, I heard people saying, yeah, I have heard about Mozart. I mean, who hasn't unless you live in a different planet? But I didn't know too much about him, which basically means I didn't know anything about him, or couldn't even identify one of his pieces from anything else. Do you think that kind of popular culture has had an impact in interesting people in music in general?
Well, sure. At the very least, it interests them in certain pieces of music. And, of course, everyone likes a good story. So even though much of Amadeus was fictional,
yes.
It's still a good story.
Yeah.
And there are enough little points in history that might make people look something up. And now with the internet, they have the ability to do that in a way they didn't have when I was a kid. You had to go to a library and look really hard to find anything. And of course, everything that happens in music somehow reflects popular culture, just like it does in every other art.
Because I remember, one of the interesting consequences of that movie is that some people, because let's face it, the vast majority of people have never heard about Salieri, started to wanted to hear his composition, because who was this guy? Was he as mediocre as he's portrayed in the movie? So suddenly his name became kind of a household in many areas. So let me ask you about another aspect of popular culture, and this may resonate with you because you're in music education. Is the movie Mr. Holland's Opus. And some people may ask, well, how realistic is that movie in terms of portraying the lifestyle of a music educator at a public school level? So you may want to illuminate us along those lines.
Well, you have to understand a lot of band directors cringe when you mention that movie, and I identify with that. But there are aspects of it that are, of course, true. I think any good program is something, any good teaching is something that involves the students as much as possible. Teaching isn't really about teaching, it's about learning. And learning is what the student should want to do. They're motivated themselves to be there, and it's up to me not to cover material which is not teaching. My job is to take this for a music major, this young professional who is just on the inexperienced end of the continuum of their professional life. They aren't a different individual than that person they're going to be 20 years from now. They're just the less experienced version of that person. And so they come with lots of experience and knowledge already into my room. And they come with certain innate human characteristics that I can use as a teacher. They're innately curious. They innately like a good story, as we just talked about. In my case, the students entered this field and they're in my class because they love music. So I have a lot to work with. They're interested in learn, but they're not interested in just memorizing a bunch of stuff that I throw at them. And the same is true then at the school level, the public school music teacher. There are some that are just amazing. We just had a teacher in New York win the first Grammy for his work as a music educator. And if someone can look that up and look at the video and watch what he does, I mean, it's what I'm talking about. He uses those characteristics of the student and guides them forward rather than trying to lay stuff on them. He helps them experience the things they need to gain comprehension and grasp the concepts, and then be able to talk and have musical discourse, critique, performance, and just talking about music.
Well, let me ask you then a question that probably some parents who are listening to this show with small kids may be thinking about is, my kid doesn't want to be a musician. I don't want him or her to be a musician. So why it is important to have a musical education?
Well, it's a two-part question. I say your kid will be happiest if they get to do what they pick the field that they'd like to go into. Why should they have a musical education? Well, music is important in school because it's important in life. Why is anything in the curriculum at a school? It's in the curriculum of the school because it's important in life, not because it's necessarily something you need to carry out a task at a job. Music is an innate part of every culture at every level. It is a way we pass down knowledge to each other. It is a way that reaches people in symbolic ways that words are not sufficient. And it brings forth the whole range of human experience. It carries history, it carries the arts, it carries mathematics. As you know, it was once a critical part of any university curriculum to study music with math in the same room usually.
Yep.
And I mean that's the basic reason. Besides being rewarding and all, but as I said earlier, there's plenty of research that shows the ties between academic success. If you're interested in standardized testing, it has been shown many times, replicated many times, that music students do better on standardized testing, way better, and especially instrumental music students. All music students do, but especially those who play instruments. And it makes sense if you know anything about much of the current brain research, neurological research. We know that it's the difficult task that has multiple facets that makes the brain connections grow fastest and most robustly. And what does that better than playing an instrument where you have to deal with the mechanics of the instrument, the mechanics of breathing, the mechanics of your mouth, the sound, the intellectual aspects of listening and playing music. I mean, name something for me that involves so much of an individual's intellect and physical capacity as playing music.
Okay. So, I mean, we have heard, now that you mentioned that, the neurological studies and everything else, these theories that were floating around a few years ago about, if you get even a baby to start listening to Mozart.
The Mozart effect.
Yeah.
Well,
what is true about that?
Well, that's been discredited.
That's what I heard.
We don't know why their study worked out. I don't believe it was ever shown that their data were specious, but it just couldn't be replicated.
Well, that's a bad sign.
Yeah, right. That's a bad sign, and it was just one of those things that chance entered into it in a way that is, research is supposed to prevent. But I mean, it happens.
And it sounds like an appealing story anyway, so that's why
well, it sounds
a lot
good.
of people bought it.
Well, yes, especially since we were right into the beginning of the helicopter parent generation and indigo children and things like that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you just mentioned the the issue of neurological studies and everything else. And I was wondering, in which ways has music education changed in the way it is performed today, let's say, compared with 25 years ago? How have been the major improvements or changes that we can see today that we couldn't see that long ago?
I think it's the general actually it comes from outside, and I think it's the general access to all types of music, and in large part very good performances of all types of music. Any person now with any MP3 access, internet access, iTunes, etc., has access to so much more than what I had access to it as a child. I mean, you had to go to a record store. It was expensive. Even then, record stores were fairly limited in what they carried unless you lived in a big university town. So I think that's probably the number one thing that's changed. I think we have, it's hard to believe, but I think we actually have more sophisticated listeners than we used to have. Now, they're not always sophisticated in a way that you might like as the teacher, but you can take that and use it. That's a frame of reference from which the student comes and has experience in, and that's where we start.
Yeah, because something I have noticed among music students is the fact that when they have to perform a particular piece, they actually go to the internet and watch and listen to different performances to get a clue. And I think it's interesting because that is a very important way to tell them that there are different ways to interpret the same score.
Right. Now, they don't know quite how to catalog those differences in their mind, of course. But I find these things very useful, a very big help to me as a music theory teacher, because they are now, they've grown up with the social media. And, of course, there's a dark side to that, a very almost a narcissistic aspect of that. But I find that students are far more open to critique than they used to be, at least in my experience. Or I've just gotten better at it. But what I find is they put things online all the time and ask. And if you look on YouTube, just for example, you'll see many people post it and say, tell me what you think. Or they're beginning, I see a lot of beginning instrument players. They decide they want to play harmonica or something like that. And so they get one, they have no idea what they're doing, they don't really necessarily have a teacher, but they sit around and practice, and then they make a film of themselves, and from my, of course it's terrible, but they don't know that because they're just a beginner, they can't hear it yet. And but then they put it on for critique. That says something really positive that I can use and I can work with. And I think that's fantastic. I think it's a fantastic side thing of that, because that's one of the most important forms of musical discourse.
Now, music education in this country, I have found it to be quite different music education in other countries.
Sure.
But I don't think most of the public realizes that. Can you summarize for our audience what are those major differences between music education in the United States and elsewhere?
Yes. Well, of course, the most basic is that outside of the United States and much of Europe, but especially in England and Germany, music is taught orally by sound, and perhaps many countries by the oral traditions within a town or a village, or elders, cultures where those things are still at play and important. And so much music education comes then from that. It's not necessarily, it is a formal music education, but it's not an institutionalized formal music education. And so, of course, everyone in our country may have the experience of school music, where you're in little rows and you sing little songs and play sticks and things like that, some of which is really quite artificial and may teach you about music without really making you necessarily musical. There are good aspects of both, but I'd say that's the primary difference, but it's a big one.
Because another thing I have noticed, for example, between musicians in this country and musicians who have been educated in Europe is, although you find great performers in Europe, in general terms, a person who has been educated in music in this country is a much faster reader of music than someone in Europe. Why do you think there was this drift in the United States to emphasize so much the ability to read fast and to be able to perform what is written in just one or two readings?
That's interesting. I don't know if I can prove that, what you said, but let's take it as and say that for the sake of argument. I'd say the answer to that is I don't know, but I would surmise that very early on, forms of music literacy have been very important here. But I also know there are plenty of students who are not strong sight readers in the United States. They may appear to be. I think it really comes from the way an individual was taught. I think there are more individual differences. If you learn to play largely by ear, you may or may not be a slow reader. If you learn right away, reading music right away, you may or may not be a good sight reader. I am a good sight reader. I always was a good sight reader because I always see information as chunks and can always look ahead. My wife is a very decent piano player, but she's not a particularly good sight reader because she sees it as it comes on, that she's ready to play it. So as a pianist, she's had way more piano technique than I have because that's not my main instrument. But in many ways, I can sit down and play something, and she has to sit and work at it. So I think it may be just individual
variation
or region, perhaps.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I have many more questions, but we are running out of time.
Sorry.
So I have only one final question for the last 15 seconds that we have is, what is your next big project?
Oh, wow. Well, besides being chair of the department, which is my current biggest project, which I just began, I'm actually right now outlining a book on teaching music. I'm working on outlining the proposal for that.
Well, I wish you the best of luck
Yeah.
with that new project. So we have here Professor Darryl Coan of the Department of Music at Southern Illinois University. And next week, we're going to have Professor Alicia Alexander of the Department of Speech Communication, who will be talking about the importance of interpersonal communication. So stay tuned.
This has been Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a production of the Department of Mass Communications at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. All rights reserved, 2014.